Our second lesson is the gospel lesson. It comes to us from Matthew 9, verses 35 through 38. Then Jesus went through all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, curing every disease and every sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
It was a hot day. The air shimmered in the distance. It was a good day to sit in the doorway of the tent, waiting until the heat abated before doing any work. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. He thought he saw 3 figures approaching. Who'd be out traveling in the heat of the day? But the mirage didn't vanish, and there were indeed 3 strangers approaching. Perhaps they would turn and go in another direction. Perhaps he would send a servant to intercept them and encourage them to travel on after politely sharing some water and bread. But then he thought better of it. He'd once been a stranger to this land. He knew what it was like to be received graciously. He knew what it was like to be turned away. He believed in the ancient code that said hospitality to strangers was important. He roused himself and ran to meet them. He used the customary form of greeting for visitors, for strangers. He offered water for their feet and a meal, and they accepted. He ran to make the appropriate arrangements. He'd been blessed while living in this land, and he knew custom required him to spread a full table. Bread would need to be baked and a calf prepared. He set the arrangements in motion and hastened to entertain his guests. And when the food was ready, he waited upon them while they ate. The 3 strangers enjoyed the meal. Almost 4,000 years ago, a man named Abram, who we also know as Abraham, spread a table of hospitality for 3 strangers by the oaks of Mamre. The idea of hospitality in the Bible is closely identified with the stranger. Like so many other biblical concepts, it stretches us beyond what we consider reasonable. Love your enemies. Rejoice when you suffer for Christ. Blessed are you when people revile you for the sake of Jesus. Maintain your faith even when persecuted. Welcome strangers into your midst. The biblical writers weren't naive about what it meant to welcome the stranger. They knew there would be risks. Abraham practiced hospitality with care, but nevertheless, he understood the strangers were to be treated as special and unique. He welcomed strangers who brought to him and his wife Sarah a divine and wondrous message. We want to believe ourselves to be able to be welcoming of strangers. Would we run like Abraham to greet a stranger who entered our church doors? Oh, I'm not talking about that well-dressed stranger who looks like us and acts like us and obviously fits in. I'm talking about the man who doesn't look like he's bathed in a couple of days, or the woman who looks as though she lacks for the basic necessities of life, or that teenager with spiked hair and plenty of tattoos. Could we welcome that kind of stranger? We certainly find plenty of reasons to not want to welcome strangers. Things like mass shootings that have even happened in churches. It can tempt us to pull back even farther into our shells, to lock our doors even tighter, to avoid starting any outreach programs which might attract the wrong kind of person. It's so tempting to us to live in fear. But it's not the Christian imperative. Show hospitality to strangers. Do it wisely. Do it with care, but nevertheless, do it. If we consider our Matthew passage today and the wider context of the verses in this passage, we discuss something amazing. We learn from Father Abraham we need to act as hosts. What followed today's shorter passage was the story of Jesus sending the disciples into all the towns of Israel. And in that sending, Jesus invited them to become strangers, hoping to find hospitable hosts. Amazingly, the Bible invites us to sit on both sides of the table. Sometimes we're the host who spots the strangers coming and run to greet them. And sometimes we are the strangers who are seeking out hosts who would welcome us and want to hear the good news of God. It's worth considering both sides of the table and the perspective that gives us. Abraham practiced a hospitality that was not patronizing. He treated his strangers as honored guests, not beggars without means. He didn't judge their circumstances. He didn't say to them, he didn't say to himself, well, I'll host these strangers because they can't care for themselves. He didn't judge them for being traveling in the heat of the day. He wasn't irritated for the lack of trip planning. He greeted them. He made them comfortable. He gladly shared the best he had with them. What can we learn from Abraham? Well, when we practice hospitality, it's far more than saying hello when a stranger sits in a pew near us. It's about changing our plans to connect with that person. It's about giving up our resources without reservation or judgment. It's about sharing without begrudging with another person. There were 3 people who crossed Abraham's path in the heat of the day. They needed water. They needed a sheltered place to rest. They needed a meal. And on a hot day, Abraham rose and served them. He just did anything he had planned for that day to serve the stranger. Are we willing to adjust our lives for the sake of a stranger? We could talk about our willingness to share financial resources, and that's certainly a fertile area to consider. But there's another resource in our life that always seems in short supply. To be hosts to strangers that cross our paths, that show up in front of our tents on a hot day, requires our time. It requires us to stop like Abraham, to be in service to those we don't know. Oh, we're busy people, aren't we? We're working, we're schlepping the children to different events, we're helping our parents who are aging, we're dealing with our own aging issues, we're pursuing educational opportunities, we're serving in community organizations, we're helping people out in our own church who are going through tough times, we're taking vacations, the list goes on and on. And all those activities are important. It's not any single one of those that it's a problem. The issue is we fill our lives so full, we fail to have time to sit in the entrances of our tents and watch for strangers. This was a Sabbath moment for Abraham. This was a moment when he was resting and waiting. And in that moment of rest, in that moment of mindfulness to the present, Abraham saw the 3 strangers. If we're really to see the strangers that need welcoming, we must allow for time to sit so that God can open our eyes. Sabbath time. It requires us to sit and watch and reflect so that God can show us the strangers. Time for us to open our hearts and minds to watch for those who need to be welcomed. In Matthew, we learn that Jesus was on the road taking the good news to many towns and villages. And at some point in the journey, he called a halt to his effort, and he gathered the disciples. He told them to take up the task of going to the towns of Israel with this set of instructions. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick. Raise the dead. Cleanse the lepers. Cast out demons. Take no gold or silver or copper in your belts. Give without payment. Take no bag for your journey. Don't take 2 tunics or extra sandals. The laborers deserve their food. Whatever town or village you enter, find out who's in it that is worthy, and stay there until you leave. As you enter the house, greet it. If the house is worthy, share your peace with them. If it's not worthy, let your peace return to you. If anyone is not willing to welcome you or listen to your words, shake the dust from your feet and leave that house or town. Truly, I tell you, it'll be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment rather than that town. You know, the disciples had seen Jesus do all these very things, but this is the first moment that they were actually entrusted with the work. And I know they felt overwhelmed, ill-prepared, uncomfortable, but they obeyed Jesus and they went taking the good news. And that's still our charge today. We're still called to live into the role of the stranger, seeking those who would be hospitable to the message of the gospel. We're still called to go with few of our own resources. We're still called to go even if we feel overwhelmed or ill-prepared or uncomfortable. Our unwillingness as Christians to take on tasks that make us uncomfortable may be one of the biggest stumbling blocks to the church in North America. We don't want to appear foolish in front of others. We don't want to risk rejection. We don't want to be vulnerable with our lives. And we certainly don't want to go out having our emotional shields up and in place. Here's the commission we really want to hear from Jesus. Leave church. Go home. Go to the home of your closest neighbor. Knock on their door. When they open the door, tell them Jesus loves them. They will break down in tears and tell you they've just been waiting to hear that from someone. They will tell you how much they've always admired your deep spiritual example. They will ask you to lead them in the sinner's prayer, and they'll come back to church next week ready to join and make a pledge, sign up for 3 committees, and join the choir. And of course, it's going to happen again the next week as well. But that isn't the commission, is it? The disciples were sent with no resources, very little planning. They had a lot of training. They didn't realize it. They'd been watching Jesus do this for this time. And Jesus told them to go with an attitude of first offering peace to all. Jesus told them they would face rejection. Jesus told them that they weren't responsible for judging those who had rejected, they weren't responsible for calling down wrath on anyone. Jesus said, simply shake the dust off and move on. Don't carry it with you. Don't worry about it. Put it in God's hands. Move on again and offer God's love and peace and good news. You know, when we are sent out by Jesus, we must expect to be placed in positions where we are likely going to feel emotionally uncomfortable. We're called to go and trust wholly in God's ability to get us through. The results, not up to us, they're up to God. We're not going to be in control, and that's a big rub for us a lot of times. When we purposely place ourselves in the role of the stranger, we learn what it means to be the one who needs hospitality. We learn when we encounter gracious hosts how we should treat strangers when we encounter them. We learn more about the incredible graciousness of Jesus, who took the ultimate journey to visit us with the good news. When we play the host like Abraham, we can meet God in the life of the stranger. Perhaps we will receive a message so filled with joy, we will laugh like Sarah. When we play the stranger and step into that role, we can meet God in the host that welcomes us into their lives. So let's go forth ready to welcome others into our tents and to visit places where we share the good news as strangers. Let us go as strangers into the world. Let us welcome the stranger in our lives. Amen. Sisters and brothers,